Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, which is Selection and Monitoring of Service Providers, effectively working with record keepers. My name is Steve Fagioli from Strategic Retirement Partners, and we appreciate you joining us for the latest event of our 2025 Plan Sponsor Fiduciary Training and Education Series. A few quick housekeeping notes before we get started today. All lines are muted, but we do welcome your questions. If you have one, please get out your phone and you can scan a QR code that will be coming up on a subsequent slide here. That will take you to an online form where you may submit a question. I'll be monitoring those questions and we'll try and bring them up during the course of the conversation if appropriate, or at the end if we have time. We'll try to get to as many of those questions as possible, so keep them coming. The session is being recorded as well, and we'll share a copy of the recording with all those who register for the webinar later this week. Attendees can also earn 1 hour of SHRM and PSCA CE credit, which we will include when we share the recording. So I'm very excited to introduce today's speaker, Bonnie Treichel, who is the Chief Solutions Officer at Endeavor Retirement. Bonnie, great seeing you as always. A little bit of background on Bonnie. Bonnie is the founder and Chief Solutions Officer of Endeavor Retirement, which is a consulting firm dedicated to solving problems for plan sponsors, advisors, and service providers in the retirement plan industry. Her unique experience helps her bring governance solutions for day-to-day issues that are an inevitable part of running a successful retirement plan. But Bonnie is also a partner at Endeavor Law. And that's where I know her best from, as obviously we work in advisory capacity, but sometimes when things get escalated to the legal level, Bonnie is our go-to person and her team at Endeavor. So Bonnie, great seeing you today.
Well, it's fun to have the opportunity, Steve, to present with you. Thank you so much for having me, and on a topic that I know you're really knowledgeable about. So, once again, welcome to Steve as my co-presenter. I think when Steve signed up for this, he thought he was maybe just going to be a moderator. And then I roped him in, given all of his knowledge in this space. So I'll talk a bit more about our actual topic at hand here in a minute. But I think one of the reasons Steve has a full bio that you can find online and learn more detail. But one of the reasons, well, two reasons actually, that I'm excited to present with Steve. Number one, he names his dogs in a similar fashion to me. And so he's got two awesome dogs, though his are a bit smaller. So he has Leo and Lacey, if I got that right. And
Right.
the second reason is more probably important for those of you on the line, but that's Steve's client service aspect. So as Steve mentioned, I've had the opportunity to get to know him a little bit better over the recent several months. And I really enjoyed their client first attitude in their office, and how it's not just kind of the surface level, but going a bit deeper and really helping clients with some of the more practical things. So I think you'll see that from Steve today, as I'm here to really give you the basics of, like, here's what the rule says, here's what your fiduciary obligation says. And then Steve's going to come in and give you much more of that practical side of things as we dig into, well, this is what it actually looks like when you think about these concepts like revenue share and what you're actually seeing on a statement or a disclosure. So that's one of the reasons I'm really excited to have Steve here today. So welcome, Steve, as a co-presenter and not as a moderator. So anything else before I dig into our topic, Steve, in terms of housekeeping items?
No, I think that covers it, Bonnie, and thanks for the intro. We'll be monitoring those questions via the QR code, but if there's any questions that come up throughout the course, like I said, just feel free to present them to us, and we'll tackle them as they come forward.
Awesome. Well, with that, we'll go ahead and get into today's topic, which is really in this area of selection and monitoring of service providers, and leaning in a bit more to the record keeper side of things. So we will start with more of the 50,000 foot view of all of your service providers, but then lean in deeper on the record keeper side of things. And we'll hit on a variety of topics. So feel free, as mentioned, to put your questions in, and we'll take those as they come up. And then we'll also get to some questions at the end as well. One of the reasons I'm actually really excited about this presentation, and we started thinking about it at the end of last year, is given the current climate with our service providers, particularly record keepers. So the record keeping space is pretty interesting over the last decade plus, as we've seen the number of record keepers continue to consolidate. And we've seen what with record keeping fees, it continues to go down, right? Record keeping fees go down. But one of the interesting things is that as fees go down, there's always, revenue still has to come in for these service providers. And so it comes from other places. But then the other thing that's happening to these record keepers, and Steve, you chime in and keep me on track here at any point, but we're asking these record keepers to do more, even though we're saying, hey, you're probably getting paid less. And we have things like, for those of you who probably want to block this out, but you're not able to because of all the requirements, we've had Secure 1, and then we've had CARES, and then we've had Secure 2, and we're literally already talking about Secure 3.0. And while many of these things are optional, there's several that are still required provisions. And they take these big record keepers and say, hey, you've got to like retool all your systems and do XYZ. And oh, by the way, keep up with these cybersecurity requirements as well. And so it's an interesting time in the record keeping space to say, hey, fees are coming down, but you got to do more, and you got to do more, and you have to do more, and turn these big ships around and change the way you're doing it. And, oh, by the way, here's just another reg or rule to keep up with. So one of the things that I've been noticing is that a lot of record keepers are saying, we cannot give you any legal advice. We cannot help you with that. We can't do X, Y, or Z. And so it's just this changing landscape of you're seeing more record keepers really be clear about no legal advice. We can't help you with that. And so I think it just kind of creates this like real focus on what are the roles and responsibilities of all the parties. Does that align with your service provider agreements and your 408B2s? And we'll talk briefly about that. And then how do you just make sure that you're continuing to understand who did I hire, for what service, and does my actual disclosure or what I'm paying match up with those things? And that's really the 50,000 foot of what we're going to talk about today. We'll just go over who are the service providers, what's your fiduciary responsibility as it relates to those service providers, and particularly on the record keeping side, how do you dig into that a bit deeper? So that's our really high level. We've got kind of a more detailed program overview, but that's the gist of it. So if we start at our really high level, thinking about just what are your fiduciary duties under ERISA. And if you've tuned into any of these programs before, one of the things we say is, I'm going to say this in the ERISA context. I recognize that some folks on the line may be a non-ERISA plan, but by and large, even for non-ERISA plans, many of you might be looking to ERISA for best practices. So I'm going to use that as our reference point, but feel free to follow up with questions if there's a small clarification for a non-ERISA plan. But when we're thinking about this from the ERISA perspective, we want to start with like, what are our just baseline fiduciary duties as it relates to selection and monitoring of service providers under ERISA? And that's where we start with just looking at, you have this obligation to prudently, and I'm sure we'll talk more about that today, prudently select at the outset your service providers and then monitor them over time. And that's the initial selection and the ongoing monitoring of service providers. And that includes, when you are paying those service providers, that great term reasonableness, reasonable fees to those service providers. And you have to make sure you're doing that both initially and on an ongoing basis. And it's not about, you can actually choose a service provider that is the highest service provider in terms of fees, right? And we'll say this a few times throughout, but you can choose the highest cost or highest fees for a service provider, but that might be perfectly reasonable given the nature of what you need to run your plan. And again, a lot of this we're talking about reasonableness of fees. This is in the context of when things are being paid out of plan assets. So that's probably another kind of big disclaimer I'll make up front is, in general, I'm talking about ERISA covered plans when we're paying out of plan assets, as opposed to a company that might say, you know what, we don't want to mess with as much of this. We're just going to write the check ourselves. That's not happening a lot necessarily. Steve, you might have a different perspective on that, but in general, we're talking about plan assets. Any thoughts there?
Yeah, no, I think, this is the real premise of the conversation today, is just understanding. I think most people that are probably watching this webinar right now are saying, hey, listen, I've been with the same 401k or 403b provider for many years. Plan assets have grown. There doesn't seem to be a headache necessarily, but I want to make sure that I'm fulfilling my fiduciary responsibility, as you've outlined here, Bonnie. Um, you know, most people don't know where to start. I think the first
Mhm.
thing is kind of looking at the required fee disclosures, obviously, and Bonnie will go through the kind of a high level what those notices are, what to look for, et cetera, and of course coupling with your advisor partner to just kind of understand what that process looks like. Ultimately, why are you doing this? Not just to fulfill your responsibility as a plan sponsor, and just to be clear, a plan sponsor is the company that's basically sponsoring these retirement programs. It's to make sure that your participants, the people that you work with, have access to the most robust, most cost-effective investment options in their retirement accounts. Because let's face it, we're trying to solve for a challenge that we're all facing, and that's socking away enough money to live comfortably once we've stopped working. And sometimes we kind of lose sight of that ultimate goal. And it's not just, hey, we're signing up with the 401k provider that just happens to be our payroll provider, or that's just the way we've done it, since forever. It's just making sure that you're getting the most bang for your buck as well. But as Bonnie mentioned, there's been a tremendous amount of fee compression in this space. And those fees have come down. It's not like healthcare related, benefits that have continued to kind of feel like they go up and up and up. You have the opportunity to maybe capture some savings, even if you just do at a very high level some due diligence, RFI, RFPs, which we'll talk about more later on. But just wanted to kind of position it from a practical perspective as well, Bonnie, and what we're saying. And then the last thing that you mentioned is, our plan sponsors starting to pick up the bill for the administrative costs of 401ks, 403bs. And we have seen an uptick, but sometimes when the economy gets a little tighter, that kind of reverts back to that what we call a cost sharing model with participants and the plan sponsor. So you could be in a variety of different places, but nonetheless, whether the company's putting the bill or your participants are putting the bill, we just want to make sure that we're getting a fair deal on the overall administration of the program.
Absolutely. Such a good set of additional points and context to put us in. So maybe we'll do this, just do a real fast refresher on common service providers to the plan. And then as Steve mentioned, jump into, okay, well, what are these disclosures? I threw out some lingo of 408b2, but essentially, what's your contract and where does it say how much you pay these service providers? So sometimes I think it's helpful to do a quick refresher on who are the types of people that are commonly paid. I'm not saying exclusively this is a list, but who are just those common types of entities that can be paid out of plan assets? And keeping in mind, you can pay a variety of different service providers from plan assets, so long as they are providing a necessary service for the operation of the plan, and so long as it's a reasonable fee that's being paid. And we'll talk more about that. But there's a couple that you have to have. So if you have a participant directed plan, you've got to have a record keeper. And I always think of that as that's the Excel function, right? It's keeping track of how much Steve has versus Bonnie versus everyone else in the plan. And that's keeping track of who's got what money in those participant directed plans. And then you have to have a custodian, someone who's actually holding on to the money. And oftentimes the custodian's going to look the same as the record keeper, but many times they are technically separate legal entities, even though they oftentimes look like it's a package deal. You're probably not going out and hiring your own separate custodian from your record keeper. They probably look like they're the same. The third party administrator, sometimes you are hiring a third party administrator. And again, kind of like I just described, sometimes you might have your third party administrator as actually that same entity as your record keeper. So you might get those two bundled together as one, or you might have them separate. And there's pros and cons. There's no right or wrong answer there. But a third party administrator or TPA, that's really, I think of that as, I'm going to call it the compliance function for a lot of things. Often providing a plan document, a lot of the notices and the compliance testing. And again, I'm giving broad generalizations. One huge disclaimer I would put on all of this is you have to check your specific contracts, because it really is in the details of those contracts where some service providers include one thing and exclude something else. And it really depends on what's in that contract. It could vary depending on what size of plan. So, different market segments, for example, they might have different things that they offer. Just because maybe a prior role you had Fidelity as your record keeper, and I'm just throwing that out there as an example of a record keeper, but it might be that at a different market segment, even if you had it at your last position and you come to a new place and you have the same record keeper, they might not do the same thing depending on the size of your organization. So the TPA is going to be the person who's doing a lot of, I'm going to call it that compliance work, and that could be bundled in as the record keeper in some instances. You also have your investment advisor or investment manager. So that's when you get to have the opportunity to work with Steve or someone on his team. Then you've got your investment advisor or investment manager. You may have legal counsel, you may not. Again, that's going to probably be a personal preference of or an organizational preference. Your auditor, that's going to depend on, again, the size of your organization and how many participants, if you've got to have that audit or not. And then others that come up, sometimes you might have something on the wellness side that could be, again, packaged in with maybe your advisor, maybe that's packaged with the record keeper, or some organizations might use a third party for that. Steve, am I missing anyone from our list here?
No, I think that you've covered them all. I think just kind of a couple thoughts on what you discussed, specifically bundled provider versus unbundled. So you may have heard that term thrown around. Unbundled is typically where you'll have the record keeper, and then you have the third party administrator, as Bonnie mentioned, doing the compliance administration of the retirement program. Typically when we see a TPA involved, it's either because there is some complexity to the plan design, there's an opportunity for enhanced profit sharing design, something known as, for example, new comparability, where we skew a little bit of the profit sharing towards the ownership or management team versus other portions of the the employee population. But more often, and I think you're seeing kind of a trend, is that as plans continue to go up market, they go to that bundled solution where the record keeper does the administration, the Fidelities of the world, the Empowers of the world, the Principals of the world. One thing the other thought that I will just say about this with service providers to the plan, obviously us strategic retirement partners, we would fall under that investment advisor, investment manager fee. We can't be scared to look at the fees of all these service providers. So as a matter of practice, the way that we approach working with our plan sponsor clients is we're looking at the record keeper, we're looking at the expenses of the investment, but we're also looking at ourselves in the mirror and making sure that the advisor is paid fairly and is not necessarily getting fat off of these account balances continuing to grow if the market is cooperating, which it has been for the better part of the last 10 plus years. So you want to make sure that you have those conversations with the people that you've worked with. It could be someone that you've known for many, many years, but you just want to make sure that you're at least documenting that you're evaluating those cost structures on a consistent basis. So
I love that. Yeah, it's all about looking at the overall costs and fees and services, which gets us to our next point. So, who can think back to 2012? I can't remember last week sometimes, but if you go all the way back to 2012, you will remember this thing called 408b2. Or I would say you probably remember it if the DOL, if you've had the Department of Labor ever show up in your office. And the reason I say that about the Department of Labor is that one of the first things that comes up when you get a DOL request list is usually give us a list of your service providers and their associated 408b2 disclosures. Now that sounds like fancier or scarier than it is, but by and large, to meet what's called the 408b2, and I'll explain why it's called 408b2 in a moment, to meet that requirement, it typically, most of the time, it's the contracts for your service providers. most of us in the legal community found a way to say, hey, we don't need a separate piece of paper here. We can just put this disclosure requirement into the agreement or contract and meet both of those obligations at once. So what is it that we're talking about here? For anyone who's paid out of plan assets, and it's $1,000 or more in a year, or expected to be paid $1,000 or more in a year from plan assets, then there must be a disclosure that goes from that service provider to the plan sponsor. Now, this is separate from your participant disclosures. That's a different set of numbers, which is 404A5. Tune into a different webinar for that one. But under this disclosure requirement, it goes from the service provider, so from Steve or SRP, for example, to you as the plan sponsor. And this shouldn't be confused, but the disclosure requirement is only initially, so at the outset of the engagement, and then anytime there's a change to services, fees, or fiduciary status. You don't actually have to produce that every year. So for example, if Steve provides the same services for 5 years for the same fees, doesn't change his fiduciary status or anything, he doesn't have to give a new disclosure. But that doesn't mean that you as a plan sponsor shouldn't pull out that disclosure occasionally and take a look at it. And that's where I think sometimes we fall off track if we forget to look at those disclosures. So why is this important? What's important is most of you, and we'll try not to get too technical, but most of you probably don't think every day about this thing called prohibited transactions. But you know, if you're a fiduciary under ERISA, which you are as a plan sponsor, you are a fiduciary under ERISA. That means you can't engage in prohibited transactions without an exemption. Paying a service provider is actually a prohibited transaction under 406 of ERISA. But the exception to the rule, or the exemption, is 408B2. So that's why it's so important to make sure you have those actual disclosures and that you review them for the reasonableness, is because that's the exemption. So it's perfectly fine to pay so long as you actually have those disclosures. So that's why we make a bigger deal of it than it might feel like it should be. So what's the practical application? If you are taking action items, you should take a look at who are your service providers, make sure you understand who they are, and then find that 408B2 disclosure or contract for each of those service providers and be able to look in there and say, okay, I can identify services, fees, fiduciary status. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but that's really the high level. We gave a quick kind of checklist for how you might go about that. We won't spend time going through this in detail. We'll talk more about that as Steve talks about some of the fees here in a bit. But that's really the general concept, is making sure you understand who those service providers are, what they're being paid, and what the associated services are, and if it's fiduciary in nature or not. The other thing that does come up is conflicts of interest, and making sure you understand, are there any conflicts of interest with those service providers? You want to make sure you're looking for that too. Steve, additional thoughts on 408B2 disclosures?
Yeah, when sometimes the government creates these acronyms and these numbering, as part of the IRS code, that just, you're like, well, what are they talking about? But I think, practically speaking, and Bonnie, you alluded to it very well, is that you're trying to do what a prudent person would do, right? If you're running this plan, you want to make sure that you're taking a deep dive and looking at all the components of the program overall to make sure they're fair and reasonable, right? I think one of the key things here that I kind of honed in on was the fiduciary status. So, you can work with an advisor, and you want to just make sure you understand what that fiduciary status is for that advisor. Because if they're not operating in a fiduciary capacity, they have a different standard of care that they need to adhere to, which is suitability, right? And when you're talking about an ERISA plan, for example, a retirement plan that you know, you're giving, your team members the ability, several hundred or several thousand people, the ability to save money. You want to make sure you're doing it in a proper way and a proper methodology for evaluating kind of the program overall. So, the thing about having a fiduciary advisor is that they're sitting on the same side of the table as you from a legal perspective, right? They are on the hook for evaluating the investment options as well. So Bonnie alluded to it, that when you're kind of on a committee, or you're one making a decisions relative to a retirement program, you you could, you have potential liability associated with it. So in order to kind of mitigate that risk, that's where you bring on advisors to help mitigate some of that potential fiduciary liability associated with running the plan. Now, if you say, hey, listen, there's value there, let's make sure that we're not overpaying. For example, we've run into plans where, guess who's the advisor? It's the brother-in-law, right? Have we looked at what that cost structure is, in the last couple of years, or are we kind of turning a blind eye? You still need to dig into that and make sure that, that cost structure is appropriate, even though, there could be a potential conflict of interest there. So just some practical kind of implications of why, the government mandates providing this information to plan sponsors as they review their programs.
The fiduciary piece is really helpful. And again, probably getting back to a concept of prohibited transactions. If you're spotting those conflicts and they are related family members and such, call Steve and he will help you work through the potential prohibited transaction issues. So with that, I think, that was one, I would say, key action item we wanted to make sure that people took away today, is really just thinking through, if nothing else from today, go find your 408b2 disclosures, know where they are, and document that you've done that too, because that's a good thing to be able to put in your fiduciary file. The next thing is just really thinking about, okay, we've talked a little bit about, we've identified service providers, we've talked about the agreements they need to have. But one of the things that commonly comes up is this issue around, finding the right record keeper. It comes up with all of our service providers, but as we really think a little bit more about the record keeper side, how do we go about finding the right record keeper? And this is this idea that starts with doing an RFI, or request for information, or an RFP, request for proposal. So this is essentially the idea of saying, hey, we are going to go out and do our search process for a record keeper. Now, first and foremost, probably one of the questions I get asked almost the most is, how often do I have to do that? How often do I have to go search for a service provider? And do I have to go do a full RFP, or do I have to just do an RFI? If I'm just doing benchmarking, and I shouldn't say just benchmarking, but if I'm doing annual benchmarking, what's the rule on this? Well, one thing I would say is, if you go to the text of ERISA, it does not say in the text of ERISA that you must do a search every 3 years, or you must do a search like an RFP every 5 years. It does not say that very clearly. I think sometimes the industry standard has been said, hey, every 3 to 5 years, you should do some sort of RFP for a record keeper. That being said, I think that has been adopted because there has been some DOL loose guidance over time that said every 3 to 5 years. But there's very clear, I shouldn't say very clear, there's definitely exceptions to that. And that is things such as, it's all factor-based. What is the size of your plan? What is the complexity of your plan? How fast is your plan growing? If you have a plan that is rapidly growing and changing in size, like plan assets, number of participants very rapidly, you may need to go out sooner than others. If you have a plan that is very small, not complex, and really just stays about the same, you do frequent benchmarking. And by frequent, I mean once a year you do benchmarking, you get reductions in fees when you need it. You could probably go 7 years without doing a search. I think it's really all about that specific plan, the nature of that plan, and documenting what you're doing to get that reasonable fee based on the services that you need. So again, not to say it depends in true lawyer speak, but it is about being able to show your diligence and your process and not feeling wedded to, well, hey, one case said one place that someone should have done an RFP and they didn't. Well, it's very facts intensive in case law that you read or in what you're seeing in other instances. So Steve, I don't know if you have an opinion on the timing of those things.
Yeah, I think we're very much aligned with what you said, Bonnie, and I 100% agree. It's factor specific, right? So we happen to be in Northern California, so Silicon Valley, and you have a variety of different industries that we work with, whether it's technology, whether it's life sciences, whether it's construction, whether it's agriculture. and they're all going to have a different type of growth trajectory of their demographics and their assets, and that's really going to dictate how often we want to go to market and either do the RFI, RFP, or just simply benchmark to understand where the fees stand overall. But for example, we have some companies that are growing exponentially, to Bonnie's point, and we want to go out to market every year just to ensure. The one other thing that I will say about the details, so information provided to the record keeper. Let's say you're with an organization, you're with a record keeper, and you're not 100% happy, right? And you say, "Hey, listen, we really want to look, we want to dig under the hood of maybe some other providers that we should just be exploring." When you talk about number of participants, for example, what we do is we look at, number of eligible participants, number of terminated with balances, number of terminated with balances below 7,000 that we could potentially force out to get more attractive pricing. So these are high level bullet points, but when you start digging into kind of the reviews, you want to take all those elements into consideration. And that's, to your point, Bonnie, it's really plan specific, right? If you had maybe a workforce that is more kind of transient in nature, where you'll have somebody come in for 6 months and then they'll leave, and they'll create a lot of small balances. It may have a large population of people, but there are a lot of small balances. You could force those out at year end, and they get more attractive pricing from a potential record keeper. So just a couple of different ways of looking at some of the detail and the information that you provide to record keepers in order to get the best possible deal moving forward.
Yeah, Steve, I like how you pointed that out because we've provided a couple of high level ideas for, really getting at this, what I'm going to call objective nature of how you would run a search, either an RFI or an RFP. And the objective piece really gets at the heart of a prudent process, right? It's got to be objective. So what you want to make sure you're doing is if you're sending to 5 providers, you're giving all 5 the same set of information, and then you're requesting that information back in a way that says, hey, we want, and we'll get into this more in a minute, but we want to get fee information back in these types of formats, or we want fees that are without any proprietary investment options or something like that. Now, again, we'll get into this here in a minute, but the idea here is you're going to give information about the plan in such a way that then you can also get information back and be very specific in requesting that information back. Now, some of you on the line might be like, hey, I don't even know what I would start with knowing like how to ask for these fees and different things. Again, that's why working with someone like Steve and the team to actually send out those requests and get that information back can be very useful. But I think one of the things that Steve will be able to show is how you can actually get very different information back depending on, you could end up not comparing apples to apples depending on the ways that you request information, right? And one of the things like I'll probably talk more about here in a second is, again, depending on if you are getting, I'm going to call it proprietary pricing considerations back versus without those proprietary pricing considerations. There's just a variety of different ways that you can run those searches, and it's all about making sure that you're comparing apples to apples when you're looking at one record keeper versus another. So if I would again continue to encourage, if there's any questions, don't hesitate to ask, because some of this will get a little bit technical, but I think that really is where the practical application can really get a lot more relevant for each of your different exercises. So with that, maybe Steve, I'll turn it over to you to talk a little bit more about just like how does pricing work and how does that apply?
Yeah, Bonnie, thanks. And I'm glad you brought that up because there is a variety of different pricing levers that record keepers can bring to the table. So and I'll kind of allude to some of those as we kind of go through the discussion here. But what this slide shows here is really the anatomy of revenue sharing. And we've been doing this a long time. Sometimes we've talked to plan sponsors that say, I have a 401k in place and I don't see a bill ever, and I think we're getting it for free. And the reality is that it is not for free. And if you're not, writing a check to cover the administrative costs, someone's paying for it, and most likely it's the participants that are paying for it. So what we have here is what we call the anatomy of revenue sharing. and the various ways that both advisors and record keepers can receive compensation for the administration of your retirement program. So you see the circle here. Let's start at the upper right with these 12B1 fees. If you take a look at this whole pie, okay, this is typically the expense ratio of a mutual fund that it would be included as an investment option in your retirement account. But within that expense ratio, sometimes there's things that are beyond just the investment management fee. So let's just say, for example, you know, I'm working with a company called, XYZ Fund, right? They charge, 25 basis points to run a large cap growth fund, for example. That would be this light blue section that says investment management fees. That's what gets paid back to the likes of, say, a T. Rowe Price or an American Funds or Fidelity or Vanguard to run their that portfolio of investments that you are deciding to make available in the investment lineup for the 401k. But sometimes within those expense ratio, there's additional fees that are built in. So 12B1 fees, for example, those are fees that are paid. They're deducted from the expense ratio of the mutual fund, but they're paid out to the advisor in the form of compensation or commission. So sometimes you say, hey, listen, they're not sending me a bill, but they're getting paid on these 12B1 fees, which are known as trails as well, that are coming out of the expense ratio of the fund. So let me give you an example. I'm invested in this XYZ fund and it's making, 10% investment return on an annual basis. Sounds good, right? Uh, in actuality, sometimes if you have these mutual funds that have these 12B1 fees or additional fees in there, they're making 10.5% rate of return, but you're only seeing the 10 because they're taking these fees out before the full performance of the fund is being provided to the plan participants and sometimes to the plan sponsor. So 12B1 fees are a form of that. Shareholder servicing fees and sub TA fees, those are fees that are sometimes embedded into the expense ratio of the mutual funds that are used to offset the record keeping costs. So where 12B1 fees go to like commissions for an advisor, the shareholder servicing fees and sub TA fees go to the likes of, let's say, a Transamerica or a Fidelity or Principal to offset the record keeping cost associated with running the program. What we have seen now over the course of the last several years is trying to strip out all those additional fees. So you can move to different share classes of investment options that just have the investment management fee and starts eliminating the 12B1 shareholder servicing and sub TA fees. So, but when that happens, that means the administration and the commission or the compensation for the advisor and the record keeper has to be paid from another place, right? So what then is added is this white ring around, which is called a wrap fee or a per head fee. Okay, so if you strip out those additional fees, there still has to be some form of compensation that needs to be collected for both either the advisor, the record keeper, and or both, right? Sometimes the TPA, which we talked about as another service provider, also receives some compensation from the expenses built into these mutual fund costs. So something to be aware of. Those are all disclosed on the 408B2. That's what Bonnie was covering earlier. All those fees that are sometimes embedded into the expense ratio of these mutual funds should be disclosed on that 408B2 fee disclosure. And that's why it's very important to kind of review that on a consistent basis. So the other thing to note about this is that this may be fine, the structure where you build everything into the expense ratio of a fund. If we have, 45 employees and, a couple $1 million in the plan and we're not growing very quickly. But if you are in a situation where you're adding headcount or you're contributing a lot of money into these programs, these fees start to balloon, right? And it gets very high, and it kind of goes counter to what Arissa is saying, where you need to make sure that you're reviewing the program, that the fees that are in it are fair and reasonable. Okay, so that is really kind of the gist of this, and also the fact that people think that they're getting things for free when they're actually not getting it for free. So, Bonnie, any thoughts on the anatomy of revenue sharing that I just covered?
I think so that was so well put together, because I think the biggest thing that I've seen is a struggle for folks who might have historically been using more of a revenue sharing model and then try to move to more of the, I'm going to call it like the per head model, is
Sure.
it's this communication gap of once you get used to it, it's fine. But in the interim of going from what was perceived as being free to then, oh, now I have a cost. Oh, the cost is going up. No, the cost isn't actually going up, but it feels initially, it's that gap, right? So I think it's more, from my perspective, it can be more transparent, right? Well, not can be, it is more transparent, but there is just this gap of education that has to happen. And so it really is helping folks to understand that, and for participants too. And so that's, transparency can be really good, but it comes with that need for education, and can, what is that term, like short-term pain for long-term gain?
Right.
That's what I think about with that.
And you absolutely, that's perfect point, because a lot of times we go to plan sponsors that say, hey, listen, participants are not seeing a deduction from their account, right, on their account statement. And even though once we go through the exercise of reviewing what is in place versus what could be in place, the fee transparency does create some questions. But to your point, Bonnie, it can be tackled with education. And once people are informed of, hey, listen, in the long run, this is going to be more cost effective for you, it's a better deal than they and say, okay, I get it now. But that's a very important and a very practical point, Bonnie, because sometimes we've had plan sponsors really balk at going to a more cost effective structure just because they don't want to rock the boat and make people think that, hey, oh, guess what? Now I'm paying for something.
Yeah. Well, would it be helpful to, you brought about a really nice case study, maybe dig into that a bit?
Yeah, and this kind of dovetails into that conversation and those points that you were just making from a fee transparency perspective. And this is something that we refer to as fee geography. And sometimes in maybe plans that were set up 5, 10 years ago, um, there was an opportunity to have some index-based options that don't have any revenue sharing built into the expense ratio of the fund. But there are some funds in the investment lineup that do have revenue sharing. So what this creates is an imbalance or a lack of fee levelization, as what we refer to it in the industry. That is, if, for example, I have a participant that's investing all their money in Fund A here on the screen, they're not sharing in any of the costs of the record keeping. Uh, Whereas if I have another employee that is investing all their money in Fund B, they're shouldering the majority of the record keeping costs associated with the administration of the 401k or 403b program. And that's simply not fair, right? Those are antiquated structures that have been in place. And they, believe me, we've seen it all, over the last, 20 plus years. They were saying, hey, listen, we're going to give you, access to an S&P 500 index fund that's free, but we're going to offset it with some funds that have revenue sharing built in, just so you can have the best of both worlds. The more important component now is fee levelization, making sure that it's fair and reasonable for everyone across the board, regardless of where, people decide to invest their money. I think one other thought before I hand it back to you, Bonnie, is that we also see is that sometimes you'll have a core menu of funds that are index based or do not have a revenue sharing, so an institutional share class of funds. But then the QDIA or the target date fund has revenue sharing built in. So not only is it not levelized, you're actually defaulting people into a target date fund that has revenue sharing as opposed to some other type of investment that has no revenue sharing. So we're in the midst of going and working with clients to clean up these structures moving forward, but it's something to be aware of if your plan is similar in structure to this. Bonnie, I don't know if you have any thoughts on kind of the fee levelization.
Well, so a lot of thoughts. I think it's pretty widely available now that record keepers can support fee levelization. But I do think it's one thing that when you are doing some sort of RFI or RFP, just making sure you're understanding there's this intersection between investments and between record keeping. So a couple of points I would just want to make there is that those are still technically two different fiduciary, I'm going to call it processes, right? So each of those things, your investment review and your record keeper review, they do need to stand on their own from a fiduciary perspective. But
Right.
recognizing there are some overlaps between the two. So again, I think that's where, working with someone like Steve and the team can be very helpful for helping you recognize there's differences, and they each have to stand on their own and meet your prudent process and due diligence, but they do have this intersection. Also being mindful that when you are taking a look and thinking about fairness or fee fairness among participants, the Department of Labor does give quite a bit of leeway as it relates to fee fairness. That being said, there should be some rationale as to why you choose one method over another, like fee leveling versus not. And again, there's a lot of leeway, but there should be some rationale, and that should be a documented rationale. And just continually letting one group of participants subsidize another without any thoughtful rationale for that, I think can be difficult to justify over time.
Couldn't agree more, Bonnie. Thank you for that insight on that as well. So I think within the next slide, how do we effectively tackle this? And there's a variety of different ways to approach benchmarking your plan. There is the book of averages, for example, that just kind of gives you a range historically of plans at your size, population count, uh, asset size, of course, and it'll give you an average fee for plans, across the country. If you're actually going to achieve the best results, we found is that it's best to go live bid benchmarking. So taking all that demographic information that we covered previously, and then going back to your existing provider and saying, hey, listen, it's been a while. Is there an opportunity for a fee concession? Um, you know, typically you will probably get a proactive, like a positive result from that. And if they balk for some reason, that's where we go back and get bids from their relevant competitors to say, hey, this is where the market actually is now. And those are kind of the processes that we walk our clients through just to kind of go and get an idea. And by the way, you know, we've been doing this a long time. We don't you don't have to engage an advisor right away. One thing that we've learned and what we've done historically is just to get a letter of instruction to a advisor team like SRP, for example, to allow them to have the conversation with your provider to say, listen, we're not changing anything. We just want to explore, look at the information, the fee structure, and allow them to speak on our behalf. And what that has allowed us to do is once we come in, they know that we mean business, and we typically start getting good results from a fee concession or enhancement of service as well, because those two things are not necessarily mutually exclusive. We can kind of capture the best of both worlds, but you don't have to overcommit right off the bat. But it is best to go live bid versus just average fee benchmarking. So Bonnie, I don't know any other thoughts on kind of that approach to making sure that you're getting a fair and reasonable deal.
Yeah, I love that because it's saying, it's one thing to just do a look back, but again, as the market continues to change pretty fast, having that live bid or, I've heard it called different things in the marketplace, but essentially that real data with real information, it creates a different sense of urgency from some of the service providers. I think one, having an advisor, or two, having that, hey, it's real live information, it just gets a different sense of urgency than just using look back data. So I think that can be very useful. So I think, we've talked about a lot of different things so far. One of the things I wanted to just kind of re-emphasize is that there isn't a one size fits all for how this works. It's really about, documenting your process and showing that it's this continual iterative process. So making sure, again, based on your specific plan, looking at doing the live bid process. Sometimes you might need to do a full-blown RFP, and that you're looking at both the fees as well as then the services. So I know, Steve, you guys help with actually looking at the services too, because it's not just fees. There's more to it than just the fee side.
Absolutely. I mean, the way that we like to say it is it's kind of the confluence of service fees and kind of support, if you will, from the partners that we're going to engage with moving forward. So here you can just see an example. I won't spend too much time on this, but just kind of example of looking at the provider background, the conversion services. What are their timing standards? What does the participant experience look like? Is there support in various languages? What is the investment structure? Do they have proprietary investments that they use as levers to reduce their administrative costs? So those are the things that we want to make sure that when we do a full comprehensive review, we're doing an apples to apples comparison, and providers are not introducing a reduced structure because they're slipping in their own proprietary cash value option into the lineup. So that's really at a high level, making sure it's apples to apples, Bonnie.
Awesome. Well, I know we are almost out of time, so I would encourage people to be asking questions. There's maybe two key things I want to hit on before we wrap up. One is related to just re-emphasizing the importance on the actual agreement component. So we've talked a lot about, the kind of proposal process and how we make sure we are selecting the right service provider. But part of it is making sure you go through the selection process, and then how do you make sure that you actually wrap that up into an agreement and then continue to manage those agreements over time. And then the other thing I will touch briefly on is just something that actually needs to be addressed in the agreement, which is cybersecurity. So I'll talk about cybersecurity here in a moment, but before I do, service provider agreements have changed over time, particularly as things like, proprietary options have become a much bigger issue for record keepers with maybe their own, I'm going to call it managed account service, or their own investment options that they're putting into lineups and things like that, as well as issues around privacy and data security and those types of things. So one of the things to just be mindful of is when you are going through from like an RFP and then finalizing that in the actual agreement itself, really thinking through, hey, does what I think I'm getting from this RFP actually match what comes out in that final agreement that I'm going to sign off on? And it's everything from service level guarantees. In other words, hey, if this record keeper messes something up massively for my clients, what is the guarantee that I'm going to get from them that they're going to make it right, that they're going to fix it? Or am I going to be calling my own fiduciary liability policy to fix it for me? Do I understand what this record keeper's role is? Some will take something on called 316 or discretionary services. Do I understand the extent of that discretion? Or is it really more like 5 select discretionary services and you're still on the hook for the rest of it? Are you clear on the types of payroll capabilities that have been agreed to? And again, we could do a whole nother thing on data and integration and that sort of thing, but just really getting clear on, is the negotiation represented, and how does that increase or decrease your liability as a plan sponsor? And that really gets us to the last point, which is, we'll make this homework for everyone, but it's related to cybersecurity. So no one wants to talk about it. We could do, again, a whole nother session on it, but cybersecurity, the guidance came out in 2021 and then again was re-articulated in 2024 and applied to both your retirement plans as well as your health and welfare plans. And the issue here is just making sure any service providers you're giving PII to, or that participant related data, you should be familiar with what are the cybersecurity practices of any of those providers. So your record keeper is probably the primary one, but also thinking through, your payroll provider and others, and really just making sure you're clear on how are they protecting data, and is that associated or wrapped back into that agreement with that service provider? So I know we've only got a couple of moments left and want to save time for Steve to make some concluding remarks. And if there's any questions, make sure that we get to that as well. But with that, we'll just kind of talk about, any action items. And Steve, what did we miss today that you wanted to make sure we covered?
No, I think we covered quite a bit. It's something that we deal with on a day-to-day basis, so it feels pretty fluid and natural for us to converse. But I know for most of you that are running a retirement program, um, this is not the only thing that you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So we're always happy to have the conversation to help you along the way. There was a question that was posed, Bonnie, that says, fees are not always clearly disclosed in the 408b2. Where should we be focused? And I'll let you speak to that, but I'll just give my thought really quick on that. Is that what we always typically look for is required revenue. What does the administrator of your retirement program need to run an effective program from a cost perspective? So that boils down to required revenue. So when you go into the 408b2 disclosure, you will see a bottom line number typically that shows what the required revenue is. And then that will be the basis for kind of negotiation and then also for benchmarking it versus other prospective record keeping providers moving forward. So if you ever want to look at that together, let us know. But Bonnie, any other thoughts on kind of where they should be focusing on that 408b2 just to make sure that they're getting the most bang for their buck?
Yeah, I think that's a great point because especially so, and again, different ones are going to be different. Like the advisor or investment manager agreement or 408b2, it's going to pretty clearly probably say fiduciary services, non-fiduciary services, and the fee. And that's going to be pretty straightforward. Whereas on a record keeper 408b2, Steve, to your point, there's probably going to be a page of like all kinds of different fees. And then that required revenue is really going to be the one that you want. But there's probably going to be all types of different fees that are disclosed, but that required revenue is really going to be the one that you want. And the record keeper ones, they I think are the most complicated depending on
They
how it
are.
is structured. And so I would encourage, again, some of your other service providers, they can be pretty straightforward. Some of the TPA ones, that can also get a little complicated with how that could be wrapped in with the record keepers. So I would say if you are unclear on what that required revenue number is, check and see, does it, ask Steve or someone at the SRP team for help, and then also double check what is your contract, what does your record keeping contract say, and see if you can get those two to match up.
Right. And to Bonnie's point, we're always happy to take a look and just make sure that you have a second set of eyes, evaluating and just kind of inform you, because that's, really how you put a best in class retirement program in place. Is just make sure you understand all the moving parts and kind of leveraging that to your advantage. So from a next steps perspective, I think we talked about that, determine the areas where plan requires the assistance of service providers. Establish a proven process for selection and monitoring of that service provider and kind of the cadence associated with that. If you haven't done it in a while, now's a great time to do it. But if you're doing it on a consistent basis, that just demonstrates that you have a proven process in place. And then negotiate provisions. Like we said, there's been a consolidation of providers. There's been a compression of fees. So there may be the opportunity to just continue with the plan if you're happy with your provider. Maybe get those same services at a more cost-effective structure, and then consistently applying that over time, I think is key as well. So,
Awesome.
Bonnie, I know that we're up against the clock, so the certificate of completion is up on the screen, which is fantastic. So thank you so much for all the information that you covered today. As mentioned, you will get a CE reminder. A recording of the webinar will be emailed out later this week, along with the CE credit information. But as always, thank you so much for taking the time today, and feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions. We'd love to support you along the way. And I hope you enjoyed this last bit of summer. And take care, everyone. Thanks, Bonnie.
Awesome. Thanks, everyone.